Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Wes Schweer, who is the Swine Tech Service Individual for Zinpro. Wes, how are you today?
Doing well, Laura.
Good. Hey, Wes, if you wouldn't mind giving our audience a little bit of an introduction about yourself, that would be great.
Absolutely. Wes Schweer, like you said, Swine Tech Service was Zinpro. Grew up on a small town in Iowa, northeast Iowa. Grew up on a crop and beef farm. Started working with pigs in high school and decided I was going to go to Iowa State. So I went there for a bachelor's, and that's kind of where I got my first sow experience. Started working on a purebred Berkshire farm, fair and finished there, and just kind of kept with the pig thing, and ended up going to grad school with Dr. Nick Gabler. Got involved with research as an undergraduate. Got a master's and a PhD with Nick, looking at nutrition and health, and came as Zinpro out of school and have been here since.
Yeah, that's wonderful. But Wes, in some of that work that you were doing, particularly for your PhD, and I think about the time you and I really had a chance to visit at Iowa State, you were working on putting together a paper that focused around antibiotic use in the swine industry, and more importantly, trying to compile all the papers that we have with antibiotics and antibiotic alternatives and trying to kind of assess efficacy, if you will. So could you maybe recap to our audience who may not be familiar with that work, just what you found in general?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was not related to my graduate work. This was kind of a left turn. A lot of my graduate work was with PRRS and PED, and then Nick had come to my office, asked if this was something that I wanted to do. So a little note to grad students, don't be afraid to take an opportunity if there is one. But yeah, really what we did, compiled all the information that was published on antibiotic alternatives, and that encompasses a lot of different things. So we tried to break it into different categories in a very broad sense. So we had probiotics, prebiotics, oligosaccharides, zinc oxide, copper sulfate, a lot of different categories. I think we ended up with 9 categories and did a literature search from 1990 until, at that time, would have been through 2016. And initially, we started sorting through about 24,000 papers and kind of whittled it down to about 1,000 that met the criteria that we were looking for. And that criteria was performance, so average daily gain, average daily feed intake or feed efficiency, or mortality. If it mentioned any of those things, then we kept it. And it got a lot of questions. Hindsight should have done a meta-analysis on it, but it was really a literature search or a literature review because it wasn't tied to my graduate work. So this was just kind of a special project. And really what we found is not everything works 100% of the time. As much as we wanted one silver bullet or one ingredient or maybe even a couple ingredients to replace antibiotics, because this was ahead of the VFD, which was being implemented on January 1st of 2017. So we were really looking for that alternative. Here's the secret sauce. Here's the magic ingredients that's going to make it, seamless transition and going to make it work. A couple highlights out of that, I guess. Zinc oxide and copper sulfate improved performance about 40% of the time, and probiotics did about the same. There's probably some publication bias. This was academic settings for a lot of it. I'm sure on the probiotic side, at least, there's a lot of things that didn't get published. Coming through grad school, do a lot of projects that may or may not get published, depending on the results. So, but yeah, it was really interesting. Performance was really the metric we were looking at once we got into health. And kind of survivability, mortality. Not a lot of studies reported it. I know that's been a discussion at a lot of recent conferences, especially ahead of the mortality conference coming up in October. But yeah, definitely underreported, and kind of shined a light on we've got a long ways to go before we're going to get all the performance back that we lost.
I think there's a couple of series of questions that pop into my mind. One of them you had thrown out there was the words prebiotics and probiotics. And some of our audience may not really be familiar with the difference? And I don't know if you can shed a little bit of light on that for some of our listeners.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not an expert by any means in probiotics and microbiome, but I'll just stab at it. So probiotics would be, we're feeding that bug directly, whether it's a bacillus or a bifidobacterium, a lactobacillus were some of the common ones. So that's when we would put that into the diet, or sometimes administer through the water, and we would feed that directly. A prebiotic would be, I guess my mind really goes to fiber. Oligosaccharides would be in there as well, that we're trying to feed the good bugs that are in the gut. So, and a lot of, in a few papers, and it made it a little bit hard to tease out, is the symbiotic effect, right? Should we feed both? Do we need to feed both? Is there, what combinations do we need to do to really establish that colonization of the probiotic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's a very good description just to help people think about the differences, because we throw out, I think, a lot of different terms when we start talking antibiotic alternatives. We talk about organic acids, and probiotics obviously are a big one, and then of course our minerals. When you think about the literature, when you were doing the searches, particularly mortality was a hard one for us to come to. Did you have many studies that really had the power of the test to really assess mortality?
We really didn't, especially on a mortality scale. When we need thousands, at least a couple thousand animals probably to have a true power test, or the right kind of power for that metric. So none that I recall. This was about 4 years ago when I did that, but nothing really stands out as far as the big study that's going to answer that question. We did a follow-up study, and Kristen Olson published that, and that was closer. That was a couple hundred animals, and we did get closer to that number for power, but it's just a lot of observational type data, at that point, where it's maybe 60 animals of treatment or 20 animals of treatment. Some of them even had 4 or 5. So it had a big range. I think the highest N per treatment was maybe 1,000 in one study. So maybe there was one that we could tease out if they reported it. Is the caveat within that. I would say about 15% of studies reported some sort of mortality of that 1,200 that we ended up with.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of leads to the next question. How many of those studies did you see an actual infectious study, whether it was a purposeful exposure or they were in a barn that had a known risk of certain pathogens? Did we have many that way, or were most of them, as you mentioned, very controlled in the research settings with high health pigs, and we look more at just general changes in performance?
Yeah, a lot of them were performance driven, high health pigs, really clean academic type environment. There was 134 challenge studies. So we broke the studies into, one paper may have a couple different trials depending on their treatment setup. So if an example, there's a control diet and they supplemented, one treatment was an organic acid, one treatment was a probiotic. So we count that as 2 studies within the same paper. So we had about 1,000 papers. We had about 2,000 treatments or 2,000 comparisons. And out of that 2,000, there was 134 challenge studies. So 0.5%, 5%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that kind of leads me to some of the next questions in terms of, so you said zinc in particular and copper had about a 40% response rate or efficacy rate. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you were finding in those studies in terms of, again, were those non-challenge studies, and was that simply just that feed efficiency response that we typically expect to see, or can you give us a little bit more information about what specifically you were seeing with those?
Yeah, so just like you said, it was pretty common to see that feed efficiency response. We'd see an increase in growth in about 40% of those studies. Just a little bit surprising, and probably what we would hold true in commercial environment is we get an increase in feed intake with zinc oxide, especially. Copper sulfate maybe is coming on later in the nursery to help with some of that, but We only saw an increase in feed intake in about 25% of those studies with zinc oxide. One thing that really stuck out is the levels ranged quite a bit, anywhere from 1,500 to 3,500 for zinc oxide, then different combinations with copper sulfate. But yeah, I did see that feed efficiency response. And then to the mortality side, we were able to look at, especially in the challenge studies. So we broke it out into challenge and non-challenge. And actually, zinc oxide wasn't at the top of the list for mortality response. Probiotics had a better, as a percentage of the total studies, probiotics had a better response, and actually organic acids did as well, where zinc oxide was kind of down the list. In a general sense, when we moved to a challenge study, zinc oxide, was top of the list. 15% of those studies showed a positive response to mortality. So that, seems like what we're doing in the industry now is the best we can, best with what we've got. So that really stuck out at the beginning. And I'd be remiss if I was talking with Nick about this probably a month ago, and said, the answer to the question is going to be different depending on the question that you ask. Do we want to improve growth? Do we want to improve feed intake? Do we want to reduce scours? What's the metric of success? So within each of those, and scours, again, was pretty underreported in a lot of those studies. And depending on what our actual target is, the ingredient of choice might be different.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking about in my head is a scour just isn't a scour, right? It could be E. coli, it could be salmonella, clostridium, you name it. And so is it an egg antibody? Is it a probiotic from company A or a probiotic from company C that's more effective? And so when you think about the fact that you had 1,000 papers, when you really start to break it apart, there's really not many papers that you could probably successfully categorize and say, these are the E. coli papers. And we looked at, under these conditions, this is what we saw. There just probably wouldn't be very many of them because if we really break it out, I think we'd have so many different subcategories that it's just overwhelming. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like I said, we painted with a pretty broad brush for this. Probiotics, maybe it's a Bacillus subtilis, but it's now that we keep adding on to the end of the names of those, were they the same? Were they different? Was the dose the same? Duration showed up, for a lot of these. What showed up was you kind of have to use it for the whole nursery period, somewhere in that 40 to 50 days. If you feed probiotics or prebiotics or organic acids for that long, you improve your chance of seeing a response compared to maybe 20 days. So yeah, there's a lot of different variables to try and make that comparison. Like you said, it's you limit it pretty quick on the number of papers that you can actually look at.
Yeah, and I always think of the pre versus post infection, right? So even doing a challenge model, which we love to do disease work because that's obviously what we're interested in if we're looking at antibiotic alternatives, but just introduction of disease creates a lot of variation in our data. And then there's always the argument of, well, should the product be in before or after the animal is, quote, exposed to the disease? And how does that change that response? So, we just continue to layer it. So, based on all of that and that lit review, what would be your recommendation to move forward as an industry to look at this?
Yeah, there's not going to be one silver bullet that's going to make all the problems go away. And it's actually helped just put a lot more thought into what kind of combination of products do we want. If we think organic acids, I think at least in the US, that's pretty standard that we're going to run an acid in the feed or through the water, for at least the first couple of phases of the diets. If we pair that with a probiotic, are we pairing it with the right probiotics? Not all probiotics like the same pH range. So, a bacillus may have a pH range of, optimal growing conditions in a 7 to 8, where a lactobacillus is going to be able to thrive in a lot more acidic environment. So thinking of those different combinations, and then if we throw in a prebiotic source, what's going to be the right one to help feed that bacillus or that lactobacillus? Just thinking of kind of really drilling down deep into some of the literature and seeing, are we giving ourselves the best chance? I think we've tried a lot of different things, especially on the acid and probiotic side. And did we pair them together the right way? So I think zinc oxide, at least for the time being in the U.S., is definitely going to provide some benefit. I know globally that's getting harder and harder to do. So we've got that to fall back on in the U.S. right now. But yeah, it's going to be a combination of products, and if I put my sales hat on for a minute, what's everybody willing to pay for something like that too? There's a limit to, if we throw the kitchen sink at these pigs, what's the cost threshold that everybody's going to be able to deal with?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, because I've been in those situations where you put everything in the diet and you probably still didn't move the needle much compared to obviously some of our more other options or more effective options, such as an antibiotic itself.
Yeah.
But you also just raised a point there with zinc alternatives or zinc oxide. And so you mentioned, of course, worldwide it's becoming harder and harder. When we talk about zinc oxide, as we know in Europe, it is removed from the diet. So what should we start thinking about here? Because I think that's always that conversation we have is, well, whatever happens in Europe probably will happen here in 10 to 15, 20 years. So what should we be thinking about?
I think at least thinking about it. We had a chance with the VFD, and I think we can learn a lot from that, at least in preparation of, we don't know when it's going to happen in the US, but at some point it probably will happen. Circumstances between here and Europe are a little different with land mass and some of that as far as environmental load of zinc and copper and some of that, but public perception and everything else, who knows how long anything like that will be around. That seems to drive a lot of policy lately for feeding pigs. So yeah, I think just being aware, and there's a lot of different people that are at least thinking about it. I don't think anybody's implemented anything on a large scale quite yet. One thing that we've had the luxury of, I guess, as a nutritionist, is we can keep increasing our zinc oxide level. I was talking with a colleague the other day, zinc oxide creep, right? I think I was talking with Wayne Cass in the early 90s. This started at around 2,000 or 2,500 in the Netherlands. And now there's folks that are feeding 3,500, 3,000, 5,000. So, if 2,500 didn't work, just pump it up another pound or another half pound and we'll take care of it. So we've had that luxury. And I think we're starting to realize that maybe that's not the right way to do it. So start backing those levels down. And what can we pair it with? Again, what's the right ingredient? What's the right combination of ingredients? And I think even from a management side, just being okay with a little post-weaning diarrhea the first couple of days. It's a lot of change for a nursing pig to go from a milk diet to a solid diet, new environment, new pen mates. It's a lot of change. It's a lot of stress. Give them a few days. If there's still scours, then maybe we start to look at some sort of problem. But just on the management side, starting to be okay with pigs not looking perfect maybe all the time.
Yeah, I think you bring up some very good points there, particularly about when you make the comment about pairing it up with other things. Again, we need to go back and work with our veterinarians, work with the diagnostics, and make sure we really understand what we're chasing. Is it viral? Is it bacterial? And, are we coming in with it, or are we getting it once we're there? And obviously that changes how we're going to present our other options, right? Through the water, through the feed, et cetera. So, that's going to be key. And I don't believe throwing the kitchen sink is going to fix it because, again, as we've learned with antibiotics and everything else, the more targeted we are, the more effective we can be. So I think that's a very good point that you raise.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point there too with the enterics. That's what we think about a lot with nursery. E. coli's, maybe some salmonellas, a lot of the bacterial side. I don't know if I haven't heard of zinc being as effective for the viral, the rotaviruses, 𝘪𝗵𝘀 𝗪𝗏 this morning. It just a lot of those things. That is zinc oxide going to give us a similar benefit to the viral challenges that we might face in early wean pigs versus the bacterial side?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other thing I heard you also say was being okay with a little bit of post-wean diarrhea, and I think that's something that's really important. That's been a conversation for years when you get called into a barn with a producer is how much is too much, and when do we say nope, this is definitely a problem versus let's give them a day or two to transition. And do you have any tips on that when you're working with producers? What you like to recommend?
Not a hard and fast rule, I guess. I've had the opportunity to grow up with it a little bit and see it, so I was always just kind of all right with it. Part of the reason is I didn't like giving that many shots either, just from a personal bias standpoint. But I would say if it's in the first 4 or 5 days, maybe just let it play out, see what happens. If we start getting 6, 7, 8, 10 days, maybe there's some sort of issue that we have now that we need to start looking at. Maybe it's pulsing an antibiotic or what kind of acid do we need to run or change, or what do we need to look at from a treatment or a management standpoint there.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and certainly anytime mortality jumps, then obviously
Yeah.
that's a time to intercede and make a change. But I would agree if we particularly anytime we phase change in the nursery, if we see a little looseness for a day or two, no mortality associated with it, 9 times out of 10, it's just even an adjustment off of the soybean meal that they're gonna make a little bit of a response to, and then they move
Yeah.
on. So I think
Yeah.
that's also very good to remind people is, to be aware of what's happening around the whole barn holistically, not just this one pig in this moment.
Yeah. And it seems like with communication, we can avoid some hiccups, or just being, as a barn manager, producer, whatever, maybe expect we're going to have a diet, a diet change in day 8, day 7, whatever it might be. And about 2 weeks after that. So if they get loose, don't just ignore it, keep an eye on it, but it's not the end of the world quite yet either. And even if you're changing a nursery program or you're changing how you're going to feed budget, just make those producers aware of that, all right, instead of seeing maybe some looseness at 7 or 8 days, you're going to see it at 4 or 5, or it might run for the first 8 days. And if it continues, then we got to raise some flags.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a very good point. So, Wes, as we kind of wrap up our discussion here on zinc alternatives and antibiotic alternatives, what would be some key take homes that you would like our audience to remember?
I think the biggest one is, as much as we want there to be one ingredient and one solution, it's going to be a holistic solution. Nutritionists, get your vets involved. Vets, get your nutritionists involved. It's going to be a team effort, and make sure the folks in the barn know what's going on too, and get those people trained up on what to look for and what to be okay with and what not. And thinking from the nutrition side or the dietary side, just putting some thought into what combinations am I going to make, and do those combinations of zinc, organic acid, probiotic, prebiotic, do they all make sense? Are they all going to play well together to really maximize my benefit?
Mhm. Very good points. So, as we wrap up, Wes, as you know, we like to ask our guest speakers a couple of questions. The first question I have for you today is really around your swine reference. So, what would be your go to swine resource book?
I've got a few of them. NRC, common answer. One that helped me out, through grad school and starting at ZinPro was Biostatistics for Animal Science. Pretty good stats book. They even give some examples. It's a lot of dairy examples, but we can translate it to pig examples. And that helped quite a bit with making sure I can do stats as right as I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. We can collect all the data, but if we don't analyze it right, what does it tell us?
That's right.
That's a very good book. I've read that one as well. How about a non-swine book? Is there anything that you're reading currently or have read that you'd like our audience to consider?
One that I'm reading right now is called Indistractable by 𝘩𝘢𝘷𝘦. How to manage your workday and just stay focused on the task at hand. That one's been pretty helpful. A lot of children's books. We've got 2 young boys at home, so a lot of children's books on top of that.
That adds some little variety to your life, I'm sure.
That's right.
The last question I have for you today, Wes, is really about when you think of somebody in your mind in the industry that you view as successful. And I'm not going to define success because everybody defines it differently. What do you think is a key trait that they possess that helps them be successful?
Glad you didn't ask what I think, because I haven't been in the industry long enough to know. I'm still learning, but the biggest one is listening. And I've learned this with my wife, is not listening for a problem, but listening to listen. And then if there's room for a solution, then we can come back to that. But sometimes people just want to get their problems out and there really is no problem at the end. Or getting to a root problem. And a quote that I think of, it was from Wayne Cass, and I don't know if he was the one who actually said it or if he stole it from somebody, but I'm going to make the best recommendation that I know of today. Based off the information I have today, I'm going to give you my best recommendation, but I reserve the right to change my mind when new information comes along. So
I've heard Wayne say that. Yep.
we're always gonna do our best until there's new information that's better.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very good point. And I too find that the more you listen to people, the more you find maybe pieces to the puzzle that you weren't expecting that can kind of lead you down maybe a path that you weren't expecting either. So there's a lot of benefit to listening. So I think that's a very good key trait for people to have.
Yeah.
So Wes, I do want to thank you again for your time today. It's been a pleasure having you on. For our audience, again, this is Dr. Wes Schweer, who is our swine tech service individual for ZinPro. Thank you, Wes.
Thanks, Laura.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.